The Keeper of Shadows. In the heart of the quiet village of Eldermoor, a small bookshop stood tucked between the cobblestone streets and ivy-covered buildings. Its sign, weathered by time, read, "Tales and Tomes." Behind its dusty windows, endless shelves cradled leather-bound books and forgotten manuscripts. The shopkeeper, Mr. Alaric, was as much a fixture of the village as the shop itself. Alaric was a peculiar man, gray-haired and stooped, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through people. He spoke little, smiled less, and rarely left the shop. But the villagers loved him nonetheless. He was always there when someone needed an obscure text or a comforting word. What they didn't know was that Alaric was not just a keeper of books. He was a keeper of shadows. It began innocuously enough. Clara, a recent transplant to Eldermoor, found herself drawn to the shop. She had inherited her grandmother's cottage on the outskirts of the village and was looking for ways to fill her days. On a rainy afternoon, she stepped into Tales and Tomes, the little brass bell above the door chiming softly. "Ah, a new face," Alaric greeted, his voice deep and smooth like the pages of an old book. "What can I help you find?" "I'm not sure yet," Clara replied, brushing water off her coat. "Something to pass the time, I suppose." Alaric smiled faintly and gestured to the rows of shelves. "Take your time. The right story always finds you." Clara wandered the aisles, her fingers trailing across spines of books with titles faded to illegibility. She eventually chose an old collection of folk tales and made her way to the counter. As Alaric wrapped the book, his eyes flicked to her face. "You have a curious shadow," he said softly, almost as if to himself. Clara blinked. "My shadow. Forgive me," he said quickly, handing her the package. "A silly observation. Enjoy the book." Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself visiting the shop regularly. She noticed odd things, how Alaric seemed to always know what kind of story she needed without asking, how the air in the shop felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. One day, Clara stayed late, engrossed in a particularly riveting novel. As she glanced up at the clock, she realized the shop was empty, and night had fallen. "I should be going," she said aloud, though Alaric was nowhere to be seen. She turned toward the counter and froze. The door to the back room was ajar, and through the crack, Clara glimpsed something she couldn't explain. Shelves, much like those in the front, but these were filled with glowing jars. Each jar pulsed faintly, as if holding a flicker of light or a breath of life. Compelled by curiosity, Clara pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The jars stretched endlessly, each labeled with a name in precise, flowing script. Her breath caught when she saw her own name. Clara Whitaker. "What are you doing back here?" Alaric's voice boomed, and Clara spun around. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed and unreadable. I saw the jars," she stammered. "What are they?" Alaric sighed, his shoulders sagging. "You weren't meant to see this." "Tell me," Clara insisted, fear and fascination warring within her. "These are shadows," he said after a long pause. "Not the kind you see on the ground, but the essence of a person's soul. The part of them that holds their deepest secrets, their darkest fears." Clara's mind reeled. "Why do you have them? What do you do with them?" "I keep them safe," Alaric said simply. "Every villager has a shadow here. It is my duty to guard them, to ensure their secrets are never used against them." "And mine?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alaric hesitated. "Yours is unusual. Shadows are meant to remain dormant, but yours has stirred. It seeks to be known." Clara stepped closer to the jar with her name. Inside, the light flared briefly, then dimmed. "Let me see it," she said. "No," Alaric replied sharply. "Once a shadow is released, It can never be contained again. It will become part of you, but at a cost. Clara didn't hesitate. It's my shadow. I have a right to know. Alaric's face twisted in anguish, but he relented. If you are certain, then so be it. He removed the jar from the shelf and placed it in her hands. The glass felt warm, alive. Slowly, Clara twisted the lid. A rush of memories flooded her mind, things she had forgotten or perhaps chosen to forget. Her grandmother's warnings about the woods near the cottage, the strange dreams she'd had as a child, the time she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. And then a voice whispered in her ear, "You were never meant to leave." When Clara awoke, she was lying on the floor of the back room. The jar was gone, its contents now part of her. Alaric knelt beside her, his face pale. "You've unleashed it. Your shadow will no longer be hidden." Clara rose unsteadily. "I don't understand." "You will," Alaric said gravely. "It will reveal itself in time, but remember this. Secrets are powerful. Guard them well, or they may consume you." She left the shop that night, the weight of her shadow heavy in her chest. As she stepped into the moonlight, she cast no shadow at all. And in the distance, from the edge of the forest, something watched her return. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting on the video. Thank you so much.